Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready to get into some seriously murky waters today.
That's ominous.
That's Operation Paperclip, Friella. You think you know the story,
Yeah.
but trust me, we're about to go deeper than most folks realize.
It's one of those historical episodes that, well, it kind of forces you to confront some uncomfortable truths about, the price of progress and all that.
Right, right. So we're all about digging into the sources here, and let me tell you, Operation Paperclip, whole other level of unsettling.
Absolutely. To really grasp it, we got to rewind a bit, right?
Yeah.
Picture this. It's 1945. The dust is settling on World War II, and the U.S. finds itself in this, well, it's almost a sprint
Oh, yeah.
against the Soviets for technological supremacy.
Cold War heating up.
Exactly. And that's where Operation Paperclip comes in. This top-secret program, they brought hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of German scientists and engineers right into the U.S.
Okay, so far sounds like your standard Cold War maneuvering.
Right, except, and this is the big, except these weren't just any scientists. We're talking about the minds behind the Nazi war machine.
Yeah.
Rocket scientists, chemists, engineers, the whole shebang.
Oh, so this is where it gets dicey.
You said it. It's this moral tightrope walk,
Uh-huh.
You've got undeniable expertise on one hand,
Mm-hmm.
but then the potential for, well, war crimes on the other.
Mm.
I mean, take Herbert Wagner, for instance.
Wagner, wasn't he?
This guy was instrumental in developing Germany's very first guided missile, the HS-293. And how did the U.S. government thank him? They smuggled him right into the country, no questions asked. Smuggled. All to avoid any awkward conversations about, oh, I don't know, his past affiliations.
Wow, it's like something straight out of a spy movie, except it's real life.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. What's remarkable, well, disturbing really, is that this whole downplaying or even outright burying Nazi connections to get their hands on valuable knowledge, it became a pattern.
A pattern. Like, how so? Give me an example.
All right, how about this Werner von Braun? Ring a bell.
Von Braun. Oh, yeah, the space race guy. Wasn't he like the poster boy for the American space program?
Leslie. But here's what they conveniently left out of the history books. This American hero, high-ranking SS officer.
No way. Seriously?
Yeah, the U.S. government, they were perfectly content letting the public idolize this former Nazi.
As long as he was getting them to the moon first, right?
Exactly. And it's not just the secrecy that's so unnerving.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. The deeper we dig, the more we uncover.
Like what?
Take Hubertus Strauchel, for example. He made groundbreaking contributions to space medicine, stuff that's still relevant today.
Okay.
But, that's a big but, his research was built on a foundation of horrific medical experiments, and we're talking truly horrific, back in Dachau.
Dachau, the concentration camp.
The one and only. It just sends chills down your spine,
So?
All this talk about progress, and it often comes at such a steep, hidden human cost.
It's pretty messed up when you think about it.
And it gets worse. You want to know what takes the cake for me?
What's that?
The Air Force. They later published this big glowing review of, German aviation medicine and all that. They completely whitewashed Strauchel's involvement.
So they were in on it, covering it up.
It's a deliberate erasure of history, all in the name of, you guessed it, national interest. It really makes you question, what else are we not being told?
So it wasn't just a few bad apples then. This was systematic.
Exactly. And it wasn't just limited to, rocket science and things like that. This drive to acquire knowledge, no matter how tainted, it went way beyond that.
Who else were they bringing in?
Okay, get this, Otto Ambros. Now, this wasn't just some low-level lab tech, right? Ambros was a director at IG Farben.
IG Farben, what is that?
Only one of the biggest chemical companies in Germany at the time. They were essential to the Nazi war machine, supplying everything from synthetic rubber to, well, this is the really chilling part, Zyklon B gas.
Oh my God, the gas used in the concentration camps.
Yep. And what does the U.S. government do? They bring Ambros in as a consultant, just like that.
Dang.
I wish I was.
Yeah.
They completely disregarded the ethical ramifications because he held the keys to valuable, chemical knowledge.
That's cold.
And it doesn't stop there. The case of Reinhard Gehlen is another one that really gets me.
What did he do?
This was the former head of Nazi intelligence. The guy knew everything about espionage, right? And guess what? The U.S. recruited him.
To do what?
To help them build their spy network during the Cold War.
It's like they were playing with fire, bringing in all these people who were, like, just a few years ago on the other side of a world war.
Right. And the documents we've looked at, they point to this, like a disregard for the obvious ethical red flags.
Like they just didn't care or
Yeah.
what?
It seems that way. Take the case of Wilhelm Eitel, for instance.
Okay, who's he?
He was a scientist who climbed the ranks after Jewish scientists were purged from his field. He even saw one of his colleagues end up in a concentration camp.
Oh, God.
Horrible, right? But, and here's the kicker, he was considered so valuable, his expertise so vital, that the U.S. Navy recruited him.
What, to work on a what?
A nuclear project. No way.
Mm.
This case, more than any other, really makes you think, where do we draw the line? When does national interest stop being an excuse to ignore moral compromises like that?
Yeah, it's a tough question for sure.
And it gets at a systemic issue within Operation Paperclip that just can't be ignored.
Mhm.
The intentional undermining of the denazification process in Germany.
Okay, so denazification. After the war, the Allies, they were trying to like root out Nazi ideology, right? Hold people accountable.
Right. It was this huge undertaking.
Yeah.
Every German citizen had to fill out these long questionnaires about their involvement with the Nazi Party. It was a massive effort.
Okay.
But think about it, Operation Paperclip. It inherently involved bringing in people who, at the very least, had some connection to the Nazi regime.
So it was like counterproductive to the whole denazification thing.
Exactly. And the documents are pretty clear about the lengths they went to get around the denazification process for these scientists.
Yeah, it was like a condition of the whole post-war agreement, right?
Right.
Germany had to go through this denazification thing.
Exactly. And it wasn't just like a symbolic gesture. They really went for it. I mean, we're talking trials, investigations, you name it. They were serious about rooting out Nazi influence.
So how did they square that with Operation Paperclip, bringing in all these people who were, well, let's be honest, probably up to their eyeballs in the Nazi regime?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the documents, they paint a pretty clear picture of, well, let's just call it what it is, hypocrisy.
Okay, so give me an example. How did they try to justify this?
Well, they had to get creative, that's for sure.
Mm.
General Lucius Clay, he was the U.S. military governor in Germany at the time, and he implemented this, well, it was basically a loophole.
A loophole? But what?
It was a policy that created this separate track, specifically for the Operation Paperclip scientists.
So like one set of rules for them, another for everyone else.
Pretty much.
Mm.
Their backgrounds were supposed to be reviewed by U.S. agencies. Emphasis on the air quotes, by the way.
Because we already know how thorough those reviews actually were.
Exactly. It was a joke. They were basically rubber stamping their way through it, waving through anyone who could, build a rocket or synthesize a new chemical.
So what about the scientists who did raise red flags during these so-called background checks? Did they ever actually stop anyone from coming in?
You're going to be disappointed, but not surprised to hear that it was pretty rare.
Give me an example.
All right, how about the poster boy himself? Bernhard von Braun. Remember, this is the guy who was a high-ranking SS officer. So his initial background check, and I'm quoting directly from the document here, it labeled him an ardent Nazi and a potential security risk.
No way. They actually wrote that down.
Black and white. Seems pretty damning, right?
Hey, you'd think that would be the end of it.
Nope. They sent the report back demanding verification of his political background.
Verification? What were they going to do? Ask Hitler for a second opinion?
And get this, they specifically asked for any extenuating circumstances surrounding his SS membership. Like, oh, maybe he was just a really enthusiastic member of their book club. Please.
It's almost comical if it wasn't so disturbing.
It completely undermines everything the denazification process was supposed to stand for.
Mm-hmm.
Justice, accountability, all of that just went out the window.
So they were deliberately bringing in former Nazis and then actively trying to hide it from the American public, but also, it sounds like, from other parts of the government, too.
It's a mess. And it gets messier because this whole Operation Paperclip thing, it wasn't just limited to Germany.
Oh, no. Where else does this rabbit hole go?
Follow the money, they say. Or in this case, follow the Nazis.
Yeah.
To Argentina.
Argentina. What's the connection there?
After the war, Argentina became a haven for Nazis on the run. They had a sympathetic government. Elements within the Catholic Church were helping them out. It was a whole thing.
So the U.S. must have been putting pressure on them, right, to extradite those war criminals.
Initially, yeah. They were all about denazification back then.
Makes sense.
But then, the Cold War started heating up.
Ah, priorities.
Exactly. Suddenly, Argentina and other South American countries, they became valuable potential allies in the fight against communism.
So they were willing to overlook a few Nazis if it meant getting a strategic edge.
More than overlook, they actively facilitated it. The U.S. helped funnel German scientists, some with very clear ties to the Nazi regime, right into Argentina.
No way. Seriously.
Seriously. And guess who pops up again?
Wait, don't tell me it's General Robert Walsh. Remember him? The guy who whitewashed von Braun's background.
Oh, come on, the same guy?
The one and only. By this point, he was the U.S. Air Force representative on the Inter-American Defense Board. Basically, he was in charge of military cooperation between the U.S. and Latin America.
Talk about a conflict of interest.
It gets worse. The sources we've uncovered, they strongly suggest that he used his position to, well, create a pipeline.
A pipeline for Nazis?
For scientists, officially, of course.
Okay.
But let's not kid ourselves, right? And it doesn't look like he was some rogue actor going off script. This shift had approval, if not outright encouragement, from higher up.
So the U.S. government was perfectly fine letting former Nazi scientists into Argentina. But what was Argentina getting out of this?
Simple.
Yeah.
They wanted to up their tech game. Rocketry, aviation, all that. And these German scientists, they were the best in the business.
Never mind their, slight moral failings.
Exactly. It's a classic case of one country's ethical dilemma is another's golden opportunity.
And in this case, a pretty terrifying opportunity.
That's putting it mildly. And the case of Dr. Kurt Bloom, it really exemplifies just how dangerous this whole situation was.
Okay, who is Bloom?
This guy, he was a high-ranking Nazi scientist who headed up Germany's biological weapons program during the war.
Hold on. Biological weapons, like germ warfare and stuff.
Oh, yeah. We're talking horrific experiments on concentration camp prisoners, testing deadly pathogens, even trying to weaponize the plague. The whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
This is seriously messed up stuff.
And it gets worse.
It gets worse. How?
Initially, they brought him to the U.S.
As part of Operation Paperclip.
You bet.
Yeah.
Figured he could be useful, with his expertise in biological warfare.
That happened.
Well, when details of his, shall we say, extracurricular activities came out, there was a bit of an uproar. Public wasn't too thrilled, to put it mildly.
So what did they do?
They couldn't keep him in the U.S. The optics were just too bad. So they shipped him off to West Germany.
To do what?
To work for the U.S. Army, of course.
You've got to be kidding me.
I wish I was. It gets even crazier, though. A few years later, guess what?
What? Don't tell me.
He ends up in Argentina.
No way. How?
With a little help from, you guessed it, some folks connected to Operation Paperclip.
So they just shuttled this guy who was literally experimenting on people with deadly diseases from one country to another.
And paid him handsomely for his expertise, no doubt. But he wasn't alone. Another scientist who found his way to Argentina, thanks to our friends in Operation Paperclip, was Dr. Theodor Wagner-Jauregg.
Okay, what was his specialty?
Chemistry. Specifically insecticides and chemical weapons.
Lovely.
It's worth noting, just a fun fact, his dad was a big-shot psychiatrist who actually won a Nobel Prize for pioneering malaria therapy as a treatment for syphilis.
Interesting, but how does that tie back to, Argentina and all this?
Well, both Bloom and Wagner-Jauregg, they ended up working for the Argentine government
Doing what?
on a top-secret project to develop, wait for it, biological weapons.
Are you serious? So the U.S. was essentially helping Argentina develop biological weapons.
Indirectly, perhaps, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's what it looks like. And it wasn't just Argentina. There's evidence of similar activities with other countries during the Cold War.
All justified in the name of national security, I presume.
What else? It's a disturbing pattern that emerges from these documents. This willingness to overlook, even actively aid, former enemies.
Morality takes a back seat when there's a Cold War to win.
Right. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And what's even more disturbing is that this line of thinking, this prioritizing scientific advancement, no matter the cost, it hasn't gone away.
You think it's still happening today?
I have no doubt about it.
It's like, where do you even draw the line? At what point do you say, okay, this knowledge, this progress, it's just not worth it?
It's a question that's haunted humanity for centuries, right? The pursuit of knowledge, it can be a double-edged sword. And Operation Paperclip, it really throws that into sharp relief.
No kidding. We're talking about some seriously dark stuff here. But it's not just the past, is it? It feels like this whole mindset, this idea that national security trumps everything else, that it's still with us today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. The world's a different place, but the game's still the same. Recruiting foreign scientists, especially those with skills valuable to, well, national security.
It's still happening.
Big time. And it's not just about rockets and bombs anymore.
What, like cyber warfare and AI and stuff?
That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Biotech, genetic engineering, even climate science, it's all up for grabs. The players might be wearing different lab coats, but the game's the same.
So we've learned nothing.
Well, I'd like to think we've learned something, but It's disheartening how some things never seem to change. Operation Paperclip. It's a stark reminder that we can't just bury the past and pretend it didn't happen. Those choices, they have a way of coming back to haunt us.
And it's not just about the past either. It's about how those choices, those compromises, they shape the world we live in today.
Exactly. And one of the most striking examples of this, at least for me, is how Operation Paperclip, it's woven into the fabric of the space race.
It's funny you should mention that because, I remember learning about all this in school. Werner von Braun, the moon landing, the whole 9 yards, they made him sound like a hero.
Of course they did. It's easier to celebrate the achievement than to grapple with the messy reality behind it.
It wasn't until later, like much later, that I found out about von Braun's, his whole Nazi past.
It's a common story. I mean, he wasn't the only one. A lot of the scientists recruited through Operation Paperclip, they ended up playing key roles in the early days of NASA.
So you've got this weird situation where people who were like literally on the wrong side of history, they ended up contributing to one of humanity's greatest achievements. How do you even make sense of that?
It's not easy. And what's worse, even after NASA became a civilian agency, they still tried to downplay the whole Nazi connection.
Why? Were they afraid of public opinion or something?
Absolutely. They knew that if the truth came out, if people really understood where this expertise came from, it could derail everything.
No, they just kept it quiet, hoped nobody would notice.
Basically. But you know what they say? The truth will out. And in the 70s and 80s, as the Cold War started to wind down, people started asking questions. Journalists, historians, even some people within the government itself.
What did NASA do?
At first, they tried to stonewall it. That's old news. Those guys were cleared, nothing to see here. But the evidence was mounting.
So did they ever come clean?
Eventually, they had to acknowledge it. They launched internal investigations, released some classified documents, but by then, the damage was done.
It's like they always say, too little, too late.
Exactly. And even now, all these years later, the legacy of Operation Paperclip is still being debated. It's a stain on history that's not going away anytime soon.
It makes you wonder about all the other things we don't know, doesn't it?
Every time you think you've hit the bottom of the rabbit hole, it turns out there's another level. That's Operation Paperclip in a nutshell.
It's a sobering thought. But speaking of sobering thoughts, let's talk about accountability. Did any of these scientists, the ones who were involved in war crimes and such, did they ever face any consequences?
That's the real tragedy of it all. Most of them, they lived out their lives in comfort, their pasts often conveniently forgotten in light of their contributions to American science.
So they got away with it?
Pretty much. But there were a few exceptions.
Like who?
There was this one case, Arthur Rudolph. He was the head of production at the Middlework factory.
Middlework, that was the place where they used slave labor to build V-2 rockets.
Right. The one and only. Horrific place. Anyway, in the 1980s, the U.S. Justice Department, they finally started investigating Rudolph's wartime activities.
About time. So what happened?
They found enough evidence to prove he was involved in the abuse of those slave laborers at Middlework.
So they finally brought him to justice.
Not quite. Faced with the very real possibility of being prosecuted for war crimes, he took a plea deal, renounced his U.S. citizenship, and went back to Germany.
What? That's it? That's all he got?
Pretty much, as a slap on the wrist. And sadly, his case is pretty typical. The vast majority of the scientists involved in Operation Paperclip, they were never held accountable for what they did during the war.
It's like their knowledge, their expertise, it was more important than their crimes.
That's the really unsettling part of it all. And it circles back to what we've been talking about this whole time, Operation Paperclip. It wasn't just about rockets or the Cold War.
It was about how far we're willing to go in the name of progress, even if it means turning a blind eye to atrocities.
Exactly. It's a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, it has to be grounded in ethics. Otherwise, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past.
Well said. Well, folks, there you have it. Another deep dive into the murky depths of history.
And a reminder that sometimes the truth is stranger and more unsettling than fiction.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep digging for the truth, and remember,
Right.
the past has a way of catching up to us no matter how fast we try to outrun it.